Hi, I'm Pastor Ben. This is the first installment of a multi-week class called How the Light Shines Through. At Central Lutheran Church, this is our Tuesday night adult education course. I'm creating an online version here because I know there's a lot of people who can't make it into a regular Together Tuesday class, and people who may not live locally, but who would love to participate in this. This is a book study. The book is called How the Light Shines Through, Resilient Witness in Dark Times, written by Chad Lakeys. We will be working through this book as our base for how do we talk about the struggle of what has happened to Christianity in 2025. It's not just 2025, it's been happening for a long time. But what's been going on in America, and how can we understand it in a meaning-filled way, and what can then Christians do about it? This is a course that is built on real data, and a book working with real data rather than just generalization and opinion. There's a lot of feelings about how much has changed for Christians in America. But sometimes those feelings aren't especially helpful because they're not grounded in much. The goal of this class is to provide a little bit of that grounding. Today's class is the introduction, and if you're reading the book, which I encourage you to do, it really is the introduction to the book, not into the book proper. And in it, it just begins by asking, what's changed for Christians in America? Well, there has been change, and there's a sense that there's change. There is, at the very least, people see church attendance declining. In our in-person class, somebody said, well, one big thing that's different just socially, that when she went to high school, it was a very normal thing to just get to know someone. You asked, well, which church did you go to? That was just a helpful piece of data for how we understood one another. Now you wouldn't even think of it. Here we're in Eugene, Oregon, where it's a widely unchurched area. Not sure it ever really was, but there's a sense of significant decline. Those of us in ministry see ministry just getting harder. And then there is the general sense of what has truly been lost. It's not just in people's minds, but Chad Lakeys calls it Christendom. That is the social power that Christianity held. And you have to take that a little bit vaguely, but that there was social power that was held, sometimes political power, very frequently found through political power, but also just societal power, that Christians could do this. And they could assume certain things. For example, that their norms and values would be generally accepted, and that those who didn't accept it would be generally on the margins. And it frequently was tied with the state. And so for an example of social power of Christianity is, some of you will remember 1979, Pope John Paul II goes to Poland. He had not been Pope for very long, and of course he was Polish. And he goes to Poland, and in the following of that trip, the Polish Solidarity movement grows and continues to organize, and it can become in some ways the catalyst for the anti-Soviet movement to happen in Poland. And John Paul II going there, a person with, no official political entity aside from the small thing at Vatican City, but just maybe one of the most powerful Christians, at least for the sake of someone who, for their church position, if not the most powerful in the world, comes into the era and ends up visiting multiple times, and the Vatican gets involved in international affairs, but is seen as a large part of the fall of the Soviet Union, especially with respect to Poland. So, for example, this quotation, "The Polish solidarity movement would have been impossible without the Pope." What you might be surprised by is who said that. It was Gorbachev. That is to say, the religious leader of the Roman Catholic Church held an enormous amount of influence in the general world. And remember, this is 1979, not 1479. Then compare that. 2015, Pope Francis, same position, puts out a wonderful encyclical called Laudato Si on care for our common home, and tries to pivot the church, and really not just the church, but the world, to take care of the earth around us, and that climate change is a major crisis, and that caring for the earth is caring for the poor, and tries to shift the conversation. Those in environmental movement lauded this document. I lauded this document, and I still do. But did it have the kind of shift and change that we saw with the influence of the Pope only 50 years earlier? And the answer is absolutely not. It didn't seem to resonate into change. Now, I understand they're very different situations. One is a political entity, the other is an encyclical, but it didn't have the kind of just social force that the person in his very position had not very many years earlier. Something's changed here. And Christendom is that way that Christianity and politics intersect. The ability for Christianity to use power has changed dramatically. And I would say changed since the 4th century. This is not a recent, that power they held since the 4th century. It's not been just a little sugar spike in the 1950s or something. No, this has been a long going thing. And some of that change was good, and some of it was not so good. But the point is just, it has changed. People aren't imagining that ministry seems different, that people are going less frequently to church, that religiosity for what it is looks different. And we see it in the way we do ministry. How frequently is it that we're working so hard to be able to provide new forays into ministry, and it's just a lack of interest? Do we even have the tools to speak to the world around us? I mean, it's always been true that Christianity has not always been beautiful at reaching out to those who are non-members. That's what our mission is supposed to be. In fact, that's the word what mission is, sent to go do something. But I think it's been relatively recently that we're throwing up our hands and saying, I have no idea how to really do this in a meaning-filled way. In the past, we may not have carried it off, but I think we thought we had the tools. Now, I don't know if we knew we had the tools anymore. Something has changed. And so, the very structure of how are people religious has changed. To give you a classic contrast, Emile Durkheim, in the turn of the 20th century, writes his famous book, The Elementary Forms of Religious Belief. And I could have that title not completely right, but in it, he sets up that in being a member of the society was participating in its religiosity. He called it the totem and the society, the totem being the sacred site. And formal belief or not belief, frankly, wasn't his primary purpose. He was working in areas of the world where that may not have even made a lot of sense. But what it did mean was participation, active participation in the primary worship site was simply what it meant to be part of that society, so that society and the sacred were in a dynamic relationship with one another, or what's sometimes called simply coextensive. And if you are in that close relationship, that to be religious is to be in society, then society and so social power is going to be in the sacred just as much as it's going to be in the political leaders. And in fact, in many cases, there's not really much difference between those two things. David Martin always famously said that religion and politics is always isomorphic, that it's always working together and changing together. That idea seems no longer to be the case. And so, instead, we have no idea if people are going to be religious. Religion seems to be one choice among many choices for people to find meaning in their own lives. And so there has been something changed. But then what's our reaction to that change? First reaction is, and just natural, if we've lost something, well, the first thing we want to do is find it. Well, of course. If I've lost it, that implies I kind of wanted it. I don't think of something as lost if it wasn't important to me. And so we try to find it again. But if we think even more troubling is that if it's not that I just lost it, but I think someone took it from me, then my response is I want to go take it back. And that can become very pernicious. Some of you will remember the Brexit move in 2017, which was called, I might have the year wrong there, which theme was take back control. As if to say, we used to have this, it was taken from us, and now we are going to organize aggressively to take it back. That sense of of loss can lead to what James Davison Hunter calls ressentiment. Ressentiment, he says, it includes resentment, but it also involves a combination of anger, envy, hate, rage, and revenge. There are also felt elements of disrespect and humiliation that amplify the other emotions, since these are especially felt when one is in the losing position. If Christians are feeling like they're losing, and even though people who are not Christians in society maybe have a lot of sympathy because they had so much power for so long, and maybe an outmoded amount of power, that's up for you to decide. But if you feel you've lost it, and you feel like someone took it away from you, then it's more than just resentment. Then you feel like you're losing. And if you feel like you're losing, then it can have not just anger, but sense of being humiliated and disrespected. And it takes that, what would normally be grief, whenever you lose something, there's grief and anger and bargaining and things are parts of grief, but it takes it further. That I lost out of something that was kind of mine. Now, whether that sense of entitlement was helpful is a different question, but the feeling is very there. And in ressentiment, if I have lost something, I want to know why. Why did I lose it? And I can create a story of why it happened. And the thing about this story is I want to know who did this to me and why. And I can create all kinds of narratives. And it can fall very quickly into a discourse of blame. And that blame can be incredibly dangerous. Because blame is a place where I can very easily find a scapegoat of all of those bad people who were the problem, rather than any self-examination that maybe that some of this power we shouldn't have had in the first place. But no, instead I've created a narrative that exists only in my own head, but is controlling how I'm going to respond in the future. Because if I lose something, I can feel like I've been injured, like I've been hurt. And if that's true, then all I'm going to do is fight or flight. Is that I am now in an attack defensive position, and things are going to go from bad to worse very quickly. This is what we at progressive churches see happening in Christian nationalism. That there is a sense that something was taken from this from Christians, and so they want to fight back and aggressively fight back. That in fact we want this thing back, this power we had back. And there's several aspects of that. One is that I think we can understand it, and I think as progressive Christians we shouldn't be too quick to throw stones, because in fact we could do the same thing. That we can, very few are going to be Christian nationalists, but can very much feel that I versus them is where we've lived now. We speak so frequently of the division and divisiveness of our nation. In the on-ground version of this class, somebody just asked, how many here have good friends who are, or relatives who are evangelicals, who you're actually having productive conversation about anything meaningful in religion or politics? And the answer was very few were even having a relationship at all. And those who were, it was that kind of silence, that we just avoid those kinds of topics because the divisiveness and divisions have become so great. And so in Christian nationalism, but also in that in us on the religious left, you also have the space of, this isn't the way I want my religion to be. I don't want those others to be part of it. And instead, I want to exercise power and control. And the trouble is that social power was never based on social trust. And they're fundamentally different things. Power is a discourse in what I can do whether you like it or not. And we're seeing this happening right now in the legislation where there isn't trust, especially of the Christian right. There isn't trust that the nation will lead to some of their religious preferences. They don't trust that the populace would simply vote for it, or that people would just self-select. So instead, we're going to legislate it. So whether you like it or not, this is now going to be the rule. Whether or not that's a good idea is up to you to decide, but that does seem to be sort of the point. And I would say the same thing could happen on the left, where we want to legislate many more progressive, often more things built on equity, that we want to legislate that because we don't think that people will just come to it naturally or come to be convinced by it. It's about power. It's about using power. And you could use power for a lot of good things. I would posit that Pope John Paul II was doing a very good thing. But what it doesn't have anything to do with is trust, social trust. Social trust is not part of social power. Power is doing things based on your influence. Social trust is building relationship. And they don't have to be mutually exclusive, but they are different. And for many, churches have lost the social trust of the world. And that one of the major roles is therefore to find that trust and try to build that trust. But it's going to be very difficult to do if you're doing it trying to take back power that you feel is yours. And so this course is going to talk a lot about, one, it's much more complicated to this power business and what has changed, but also trust. And I just want to say one word about trust, which is sometimes we use it quite vaguely, and it needs to be used far more specifically. For the church to gain social trust, we have to recognize that trust is a relational term and it's a specified term. That is, most of us think about trust just in terms of honesty. And if someone's dishonest, then yes, you can't trust them. But there's a lot more to trust, and I like to think of it, it's not actually me, it's from Onira O'Neill, thinks of trust in three categories: honesty, competency, and reliability. And yes, you need to be honest, that's the basic one, but you also need to be competent. Because when we trust people, we should ask, well, trust them to do what? I hope that people and members of my church trust me to provide some religious leadership for them. But please do not trust me to do things like mechanical work on your car. We should, when we say, do you trust someone, you should say, to do what? It's a competency question, and then there's reliability. There's people who are very honest and competent to do things, but are forgetful, who aren't able to follow through in the way maybe they once did in their lives. Might have a little bit to do with competency too. When we're thinking about building social trust, we have to say, well, what is it that the church is competent to do in the world today? It starts with understanding what the world today even is. And then we can see, what is the role for Christians? Laquiz is going to argue that our role is to be a witness. That's not using power. That's sharing who I am in many ways, telling my story. But what's important about it is it's not just a witness, but what he calls a winsome witness. That is to say, it cannot be me witnessing what I think is wrong with the world around me, because that is a negative message and that is unlikely to change very much. It needs to be winsome. What are we for? What are we about? Why do we care what Christians are proclaiming? If it's just something that's a prohibitive, it will just be seen as just a negative thing. And quite frankly, as James Davison Hunter would say, you're never going to change the world that way. You don't change the world by critiquing culture. You change the world by engaging culture and being producers of culture. And so what's our winsome witness? What makes Christians different? Everyone agrees, more or less, on both sides, that the divisiveness we have in this country is not helpful. But Christians, and that it would be good for us not to be like that, but Christians have to offer something that, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus, to have something to do with how we relate with one another? It's not just because we can be nice people or it would be better for society, but that it is something to do with our following of Jesus. And so Laquiz encourages us to look backward to what was the other time when Christians had very little social power. In fact, far less than we have now. No matter what you say, how much is lost. Christians still have a tremendous amount of social power, but nothing like they once did. But where was that? It says, look to the Christians before the 4th century, when the dream of a legalized Christianity wasn't even on the radar. Social power was nothing, especially if you look at the 1st century, like in the book of Acts, where the number of Christians versus the number of everyone else you couldn't even put it in a percentage points because you needed too many zeros, is to say, how did they provide a witness? And you look at things like 1 Peter and saying, your goal is to be known for doing good and being a winsome witness in this world. This has been the first of our classes. We will go further into all of these topics further as we progress further into the text and into this class. This has been How the Light Shines Through, Part 1. I'm Pastor Ben.